What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Sorcerer. Specifically, we're going to be going over a heavy attack pet build. So our spammable is going to be our heavy attack, and we're using a pet, so hence the name, a heavy attack pet build. So because Magicka Sorcerers, if you are using a spammable, you're generally using Force Pulse or Crushing Shock. Sorcerers using those two abilities generally have very poor sustain, and so a lot of sorcs might turn to using a heavy attack build because they're able to sustain themselves much better because of the resource return that heavy attacks do, all the while still maintaining a pretty good level of DPS. Now, because this build does use a pet, you won't necessarily be able to use it in every single fight. There's going to be several fights where you won't be able to use a pet. For example, in Ethereal Archive on the mage, your melee DPS will not be very happy with you if you are using your pet during that fight. So do keep that in mind. You will need to have a non-pet build on the ready, whether that's using a spammable like Force Pulse or you're using a heavy attack as your spammable. You will need to have a non-pet build for those handful of fights where you can't use your pet. So just like our other build videos, we'll be going over gear, attributes, skill bar, CP point distributions, race. We'll talk about a rotation, kind of what it looks like, what it entails. Then we'll top things off with a 6 million dummy parse so you guys can get an idea of the amount of damage that you can get using this build, and kind of compare that to other Magicka Sorcerer builds you might see online, as well as compare them to other Magicka DPS. So starting things off first here with gear. For our monster helm, we're going with 2-piece Zaan. Zaan is definitely the strongest monster helm that you can use currently for Magicka DPS. That being said, you need to be within 10 meters of the boss in order to use Zaan, and it'll only attack one enemy at a time, so the proc will only hit one enemy. It's not like Rothar or Ilambris where it's an AoE effect, so it is a direct single target effect. So because of this, if you're not within melee range of the boss, if you're like moving around a lot or the boss is very mobile, then Zaan's not going to be quite as strong as other monster helm sets. So if you are in this situation where you're either playing at a farther than 10 meters away, for example, if you're the spear team in against Manticore, or you're fighting St. Felms or St. Lothus in Asylum, then in that case you're going to want to switch out Zaan for something like Ilambris or Skoria. So for more mobile bosses, I would probably recommend Skoria over Ilambris, even though both of them will pull probably around the same DPS, just because in Skoria, you're guaranteed to get that damage in, versus Ilambris, where the boss can actually move out of the proc. But if the boss is very stationary, like the Manticore in SO, then Ilambris will outparse Skoria 100% of the time. So do keep that in mind here. For our 5-piece, we're going with the Mechanical Acuity. Now you can go with Necropotence as well. Mechanical Acuity, how much it's able to outparse Necropotence in a raid is kind of dependent on how much uptime you can get on certain buffs. So like things like Minor Berserk from Combat Prayer, as well as Major Force from Warhorn, as maybe even Minor Force from Magicka DPS using Guard. So the higher your buff uptimes are, the more of a gap there's going to be between Mechanical Acuity and Necropotence. So, kind of play around with both. In a dummy scenario, they both pull pretty similar DPS, but again, in a raid scenario, Mechanical Acuity will generally pull ahead if you have very good buff uptime. If your buff uptime's not quite as good, then Necropotence and Mechanical Acuity will still remain pretty much neck and neck, with Mechanical Acuity maybe edging it out by a little bit. Like we're talking maybe like 200, 300 DPS or so. So you can kind of pick and choose. Necropotence does have the advantage of being a lot more consistent with the DPS throughout the fight, because Mechanical Acuity is very good with the burst damage. But if you do have Mechanical Acuity, then you do not need to necessarily change around your armor when you swap over to a non-pet build. For our jewelry pieces, we're going with 3-piece Moondancer, actually 4-piece because of our front bar here, but we're having Moondancer jewelry. You can use any of the minor Slayer sets, so that's Infallible, Aether, or Master Architect. Moondancer and Master Architect do pull higher than Infallible Aether, however they are gated behind DLC or expansion content, so there is that aspect behind it. If you don't want to use Infallible Aether, then you can also go with 3-piece Willpower instead, but do keep in mind that you will generally pull a little bit lower DPS if you're using 3-piece Willpower, because you do have to swap out your front bar weapon as a result. So we are going with 3 spell damage enchants on our jewelry because, again, this is a heavy attack build, so we don't necessarily need to worry about sustain. Our heavy attacks will be more than enough to sustain us up until execute, where we will have to spam our execute ability. For our front bar, we're going with Moondancer Lightning Staff infused with a fire damage enchant. Like I said earlier, you can use any of the minor Slayer sets, so Infallible, Aether, or Master Architect. It really depends on what RNG decides to give you first, so you just pick whichever staff you manage to get first. You just pick the jewelry that goes along with it, or vice versa. Typically, it's going to be harder to get the staff than it is going to be to get the jewelry. If you are using willpower jewelry, then you will need to replace this. While you can keep the one-piece Moondancer, you can pretty much pick any lightning staff for the front bar if you're using willpower. But the best front bar weapon, if you are using willpower jewelry, is going to be the Master's Lightning Staff. But that's only if you are using willpower. Generally speaking, the Master's Lightning Staff will pull a little bit below a full 4-piece Minor Slayer set, especially if it's Moondancer or Master Architect. Now, in terms of the enchant, we are going with the fire damage enchant, and that's just because in case we are going to be using Ilambris, we do have a source of fire damage to help proc the fire damage side of the Ilambris proc. However, you can swap this out with a shock damage enchant if you so desire. It's kind of up to you how you want to play around with it. Flame damage will generally give you a little bit more DPS, especially in a raid scenario where you might be getting minor vulnerability from other sources, because the fire damage does have a chance of proccing burning, which does increase your DPS by a small amount, so that's why we're using the flame damage enchant here. And for our back bar, we're going with the Maelstrom's Lightning Staff infused with a weapon damage enchant. You can go with Inferno Staff if you'd like, but if you are an Altmer, then double lightning will pull higher than using an Inferno back bar. However, using an Inferno back bar does help if you are going to be using Ilambris to help proc the fire proc side of things, but you will end up losing out a little bit when it comes to the liquid lightning damage when you're on your back bar. Plus, you won't be able to heavy attack on your back bar if for whatever reason you do find yourself leading to heavy attack on your back bar. So I would still recommend lightning if you're an Altmer, but if you're a Dunmer, on the other hand, if you're a dark elf, then you could get away with using an Inferno back bar. So speaking of races, we are a high elf, we are an Altmer, but you, again, like I mentioned earlier, you can go with a Dunmer if you'd like, a dark elf. There are 2 other races that you could potentially use, Bretons and Argonians. Argonians are generally going to be a lot worse in terms, well, not a lot worse, but they're going to be worse in terms of DPS because they don't have quite as big of a max Magicka boost from their passive. That being said, Argonians do have better sustain overall because their potion passive does restore all 3 resources when you drink a potion, so that's pretty nice to have. Bretons have some nice sustain, and they also have additional survivability with increased spell resistance, but they lack the elemental damage from Dunmers and Altmers, so those 2 Mer classes, or races I should say, are going to be the strongest choices here. For our attributes, we're going with 64 points into Magicka, and that's because we are using blue food here, so max health, max Magicka, so we don't have to worry about additional health from using Witchmothers. And since this is a pet build, we do have a passive that boosts our health when we have our pet active, so we don't need to worry about health there. So we're putting all of our points into Magicka to maximize our DPS. For our Mundus stone, we're going with the Apprentice. However, you can use the Lover. It all depends on the amount of debuff that you get from your group. So remember that the penetration cap is 18,200. So if you are using the Lover and then you have all your debuffs up, so Infused Torx, Crusher, and Alkosh, if you have all your debuffs up and you have the Lover, and it puts you over that penetration cap, then it's going to be a DPS loss compared to using the Apprentice. So do keep that in mind when you're trying to decide which Mundus stone you want to use. And like I said earlier, we are going with max health, max Magicka food. We're not going to be using Witchmothers because this is a heavy attack build, so we aren't going to need that much of that boost to regen. For our skills, starting with our front bar, we have Shot Clench, Daedric Prey, Volatile Familiar, Bound Aegis, Mage's Wrath, and Greater Storm Atronach. For our back bar, we have Liquid Lightning, Blockade of Storms, Volatile Familiar, Bound Aegis. I have Elemental Drain here for purposes of the parse, but this is where you would put your shield. So you can go with either Hardened Ward or Empowered Ward. Hardened Ward will give you a larger shield. Empowered Ward will give you a smaller shield, but for a longer period of time it'll give you and your allies minor intellect, which helps boost your regen. So that is an option as well. I personally go with Hardened Ward for that additional survivability. Now, you might see a couple builds out there that recommend using Harness Magicka, and I personally don't recommend Harness Magicka for several reasons. First of all, Harness Magicka is more expensive than your Sorc Ward. It's about 1,000 Magicka more expensive. Secondly, it is a smaller shield in general, especially when compared to Hardened Ward, so you're not getting as much survivability out of it. And the third reason is while you do restore Magicka when you're hit by spell damage, that involves getting hit by spell damage. So you know that's kind of the trade-off there. In order to get the sustain, you actually have to take damage. So that's kind of a turn-off for me. You can use Harness Magicka if you'd like, but for me personally, that additional survivability through Hardened Ward is far more important than the added sustain, especially on a heavy attack build. So I don't recommend using Harness Magicka, but if you want, you can use it. And our ultimate is going to be Thunderous Rage, the Destruction Staff ultimate. Now going over our champion points. The champion point limit, cap I should say, is 720, so you have 240 points split across the 3 different constellation types. Starting off with our green CPs, we have 75 into Arcanist and 75 into Tenacity, and that leaves 90 points, which you can kind of divide up among the remaining nodes however you'd like. Kind of depends on what passives you want from the other what are these called, constellations. I have 31 into Shadow Ward, 28 into Tumbling, and I have 31 into Warlord. Now for our blue CPs, I do want to make a disclaimer here. This particular setup is optimized for my personal raid group, my 2 raid groups that I raid with. We only get infused Torag's Crusher for our debuff. We don't use Alkosh on our tanks, so that's why I have 38 points into Spell Erosion. Depending on your group, if you are going to have Alkosh, you might need a different CP distribution. So what I recommend doing is picking up 2 add-ons if you're on PC, Constellations and Combat Metrics. Basically what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take a parse from Combat Metrics, preferably one with raid buffs, so an in-raid parse that you save. Once you have that report, you should save it and then hit Combat Metrics import when you have it pulled up, and it'll automatically pull all the relevant information except for spell penetration. You're going to need to manually input that yourself. Swap over to Champion Points tab here, hit Calculate, and it'll tell you under this column, under New, what your ideal CP point distribution is going to be. So this is optimized for my personal raid groups, but your distributions may vary. I have 38 into Spell Erosion, 49 into Elemental Expert, 56 into Elfborn, 48 into Master at Arms, 9 into Staff Expert, and 40 into Thaumaturge. And finally, for our red CPs, I like to take a one-size-fits-most scenario, so I don't have to waste time redistributing my champion points for every different content that I run. But depending on your group and the content you're running, you may want to swap CPs out. For example, in Vet and Ball, you're taking a lot more magical damage compared to physical damage, so you might want to take points out of Hardy, put them into Spell Shield, Ironclad, and Elemental Defender. That's kind of up to you whether you want to take a one-size-fits-most approach or kind of want to tailor your CPs for the content that you're running for that night. I have 48 into Ironclad, 48 into Thick-Skinned, 1 into Light Armor Focused, 56 into Hardy, and 56 into Elemental Defender, and then I have 31 points into Bastion. So I like to have 31 points into Bastion for these 2 passives here, Field Physician and Infusion. So Field Physician decreases the amount of damage you take while you're resurrecting another player, and Infusion boosts the magical regen of the person that you resurrect for 8 seconds. So obviously Field Physician is very useful because you will be rezzing more often as a Magicka DPS just because you have a shield. And Infusion is useful because whether you're reviving a Magicka DPS healer or tank, the increased Magicka regen will definitely help them get back on their feet faster by letting them get their resources up quicker. So with all that done and out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about our rotation. I will summon my pet here. So starting things off with our parses, first thing you're going to want to do is on your back bar, you're always going to want to do Liquid Lightning and then Blockade of Storms. That's because Liquid Lightning has a 10-second duration, Blockade of Storms has an 8-second duration, so if you see here on Strendar, they run out at about the same time if you go Liquid Lightning and then Blockade. If we go Blockade and then Liquid Lightning, you can see here that Blockade will run out before Liquid Lightning, so when we go to reapply our dots, we'll usually end up overcasting Liquid Lightning, which is a Magicka waste. That's not quite as big of a deal here because we are doing a heavy attack build, but it's good practice in case you ever want to move to a spammable build, or if your non-pet build is a spammable build, you always want to go Liquid Lightning first and then Blockade. Now for our front bar, you want to make sure to use your Volatile Familiar first and then Daedric Prey. Your Volatile Familiar Pulse has an 8-second duration and Daedric Prey has a 6-second duration. So in order to get the most out of the additional pet damage boost from Daedric Prey, you want to make sure your pet is active when you activate Daedric Prey. So you get the full 6 seconds of the buff rather than 5 or 4 seconds because you use Daedric Prey first and then your pet pulse. As for your ultimate choice, if you need the extra cleave, go with the Destruction Staff ultimate. If you're just looking at single target DPS, then the Greater Storm Atronach is going to be best for you. Now there is a second morph of the Storm Atronach, which is Charged Stone Atronach, which does give a little bit additional AoE damage. If you want, you can use that as well, so you're not giving up too much when it comes to single target damage, but that's kind of up to you how you want to play around with that. Now on to our actual rotation. So let's go ahead and show you guys what it looks like. Obviously you're going to buff up first with your potion. I like to open things up with an ultimate. Liquid Lightning, Blockade, Pet Pulse, Daedric Prey, Clench. Going to do one heavy attack. Swap to our back bar, reapply. Pet Pulse, Prey, heavy attack, Shock Clench. We are getting a little bit of a lag here. So generally speaking, you're only going to be able to have time for one heavy attack. You might have time for two, like right here. I have time for 2 heavy attacks. And that's basically the rotation. So you will need a buff tracker to keep an eye on Blockade and Liquid Lightning as well as Shock Clench. Because Shock Clench doesn't line up very nicely, you might end up overcasting it depending on where the timing lines up. So that is something that you want to keep in mind there. Shock Clench is kind of the one dot that you're going to have to keep a track of, and it's probably not going to fall neatly into your rotation. Let me desummon my pet so we can do our 6-man dummy parse. And then when you get into Execute, obviously, you're going to want to maintain your 2 dots on the back bar at the very least, so that's Liquid Lightning and Blockade. Some people like to maintain Pet Pulse as well, and then just you spam your mage's the Execute ability. You can keep other dots up as well if you'd like, but do keep in mind the more dots that you have to maintain, the faster your Magicka is going to go down. So if you want to give the best balance between sustain and damage. So me personally, I find that easiest to do when I just use Liquid Lightning and Blockade the Storms and then the Pet Pulse. But again, that's kind of up to you how you want to deal with that. So let's go ahead and do our 6 million dummy parse here. So I will try to narrate throughout the parse, but it's because the rotation is very static and fairly boring. Don't expect too much out of me, but I will take a note of certain things if I see them pop up. I think there's a little bit of lag here on the PTS right now, so if you see my character lagging out or doing something wonky, it's probably because of lag. If you don't see me cast Liquid Lightning, for instance, that's probably because the lag didn't pick up on the button press. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's do our heavy attack. So I like to apply my back bar dots when there's 2 seconds left on the duration. And I will generally overcast Shock Clench. You don't have to, you can let it just run completely out, but because it's a heavy attack build, you don't necessarily need to worry too much about sustain. Make sure you are weaving between all of your abilities. It's still very important to get that weaving in, even if it is a heavy attack build, because that is DPS. Not weaving is generally going to be a DPS loss. You can see here with our sustain, it's a lot better compared to a spammable build. We are nearing execute now, so I will start waiting a little bit longer to reapply my backbar dots, just because I want to enter execute with a good amount of Magicka. So we are in execute, so like I said, I like to only keep up 3 dots, which are my Liquid Lightning, Blockade, my Pet Pulse. And on longer execute phases, like against St. Ohms, you will definitely need to go heavy attack very often. You can see here we just barely managed to finish this without having to heavy attack, but you might need to heavy attack on longer execute phases, like I said, against St. Ohms, against, for example, the second boss in Vhof, so do keep that in mind. You might need to go back to your rotation for a heavy attack before going back to heavy attacking. So if you do need to heavy attack, then just go back to do your rotation for 1 or 2 rotations, and then start execute again once you have enough Magicka left to spam your execute for a good amount. So let's go ahead and take a look at our combat metrics parse. Pulled 37.6k, so that's very, very good. And again, this is a heavy attack build, so you can see here our regen per drain. A lot of that disparity there is going to be coming from the execute phase. Mage's Wrath is down here and all this stuff. You can see here that our heavy attacks is actually much better than our base regen here, so that's where a lot of our sustain is coming from. And we take a look here, heavy attacks here. So this is the damage over time component, and then the last hit of your heavy attack is a direct damage, so it actually counts, double counts itself. So the lower one's normally the direct damage hit, and this is the direct damage over time hit. So if you add these two together, then we get 9.8, which puts it fairly squarely at 4th. So you can see here, Liquid Lightning, Blockade, Familiar Pulse. Our light attacks are still very important, so this is why you still want to hit them, no matter what, because they will end up contributing very high amounts of DPS towards your build here. Liquid Lightning, Blockade, Familiar Pulse, all very high. Then you can see the Atronach is a very strong ultimate here, does more than our Fiery Weapon and Daedric Prey here. So that's it for this video. I hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.